I thought I knew what I was getting myself into. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away. No work, no distractions, just a quiet cabin in the woods, tucked away far from the chaos of the city. A friend of mine had mentioned it as a place to unwind, somewhere he'd gone a few times over the years. I was tired of the daily grind and needed a break. So when I saw the photos of the cabin and heard about the isolation, I figured it was perfect. The drive there wasn't terrible, just a few hours out of town, and the farther I went, the less civilization seemed to exist. The roads got narrower, the trees taller, and the houses sparser. It wasn't anything unusual, but there was a certain feeling in the air that made the whole journey feel different. When I finally turned down a gravel path off the main road, I saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, made of old, dark wood with a slanted roof. It had that rustic charm you'd expect from something that had been standing for decades. A few windows peered out from the front, and there was a porch with a few chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I parked my car and took a deep breath. There was something almost peaceful about the place, but something in the air was heavy, too. Maybe it was the lack of sound. The wind didn't rustle through the trees, and there wasn't the usual hum of insects you'd find in nature. Felt still. I grabbed my bag, walked to the porch, and unlocked the front door. It creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood and mustiness filled the air. The inside was dim, with a few pieces of furniture scattered around, but it felt welcoming enough. A stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, and there were mismatched chairs and a table covered with a faded cloth. I couldn't help but feel a little strange about it, but I brushed it off. I was here to relax, right? The first night was calm. I made myself a simple dinner with the few ingredients I had brought along. After eating, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the quiet of the woods. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As night fell, the air grew colder, and I retreated inside. I set up a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames providing warmth and light. It was nice, peaceful even. But then, something changed. Started small at first, just a creaking noise. At first, I thought it was the old wood settling. But then, it was followed by a soft thud, like something or someone had knocked lightly against the wall. I froze. I didn't want to believe it, but the room felt off. I had just gotten here, and the idea of something or someone else being here with me made my heart race. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe the cabin shifting as old buildings do. But then it happened again. The thud, this time louder. It came from the far side of the cabin, near the kitchen area. I set my beer down and slowly got up. The cabin was dark now, with only the firelight illuminating the space. I walked over to the kitchen, half expecting to find some animal that had gotten in, though I didn't see any signs of that. The door to the outside was still shut tight. My mind raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. I checked the back door and windows, all locked. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched hung in the air, and I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I woke up early. I hadn't slept well, and the eerie feeling from the night before still lingered. I decided to go for a hike, maybe clear my head a bit. The woods surrounding the cabin were thick, and the paths weren't marked clearly, but I didn't mind. I was used to wandering off-trail and finding my own way. There was something comforting about the idea of being alone out here, away from people. I ventured deeper into the woods, following the trails of animals and the occasional clearings. I tried to ignore the odd feeling creeping up on me, but there was something about the forest that was unsettling. The way the trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows even though the sun was out. The quiet, it was too quiet. After a couple of hours, I decided to head back to the cabin. I could feel my anxiety rising, but I didn't want to be the kind of person who let a little unease get to them. I made my way back the way I came, but something felt off. The landscape looked different. The trees seemed unfamiliar, and the direction I thought I had come from felt wrong. It was hard to explain, but I felt lost. I stopped for a moment, trying to get my bearings, when I noticed something strange. On the ground, just a few feet from me, was a patch of earth that had been recently disturbed. It was fresh, like someone had dug it up. I bent down, curious, and saw that there was something buried just beneath the surface. A small metal box, rusty and old. My curiosity won out. I dug around it and pulled it out, dusting off the dirt. It was a small, rusty container, no bigger than a shoebox. It looked ancient. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a collection of old, yellowed papers and a few other small objects. Nothing too remarkable, just old trinkets and scraps of writing. But one of the papers caught my attention. It was a note, handwritten. The ink faded. It read, asterisk, "They are still here watching. Don't trust the woods." Asterisk, my heart skipped a beat. What the hell did that mean? The note seemed to be a warning, but from who? And why had it been hidden out here in the middle of nowhere? I shoved the box back into the ground and covered it up, my unease turning into outright panic. I needed to get back to the cabin. Something wasn't right. I rushed back, the woods around me suddenly feeling menacing. The feeling of being followed was undeniable now, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me. My heart was racing, and my hands were trembling. I locked all the windows and doors, and I sat on the couch trying to calm myself down. But I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed inside the rest of the day, not daring to step outside. That night, the noises returned. Soft creaks and thuds, like something moving in the walls. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to check. I kept the fire going, and every now and then, I'd hear something shifting outside. It was as if something was circling the cabin, waiting. Couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying everything. The note, the feeling of being lost, the noise last night. I had no idea what was going on, but I had to leave. I wasn't going to stay here another night. By morning, I packed my bags quickly, grabbing whatever I could. I wanted to get out before I started hearing things again. But when I reached the door, I stopped. There, right outside the cabin, was a fresh set of footprints. Large, heavy ones like someone or something had been standing right there, watching. I froze. The footprints led away from the cabin, but they weren't there the day before. I was sure of it. I don't know what I felt more, relief at the idea of leaving, or terror at what I just witnessed. But I had to get out. I started my car and drove off, the woods feeling endless behind me. I never returned to that cabin, and I've tried my best to forget about it. I don't know who left the note or who or what was watching me in the woods, but something about that place, something about the woods out there isn't right. I still don't know what it was, but I'm not about to find out. The first time I ever found myself alone in that cabin, I had no idea what I was getting into. I had been looking for a break, some time to just clear my head, away from all the noise of everyday life. It seemed perfect, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. No one for miles, just me and nature. I had found it through a listing online, a small cabin with a creek nearby, nestled in a dense stretch of forest. The photos made it look rustic, yet cozy. Wooden walls, a fireplace that looked like it had seen better days, and a porch that extended out over a small hill. The price was reasonable, and the owner seemed like a nice enough guy when I spoke to him on the phone. He told me that the cabin was a place to get away from it all, to relax and reconnect with nature. The drive there was longer than I had expected, but the peace and quiet as I neared the cabin were undeniable. The trees thickened as I got closer, the road less traveled, turning from smooth pavement into a gravel path. The final stretch was a muddy, rutted track that barely seemed passable, but I pushed on, feeling more and more isolated the farther I drove. When I arrived, it was late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin stood there like an old sentinel, perched on a small hill with a thick canopy of leaves overhead. The air was cooler, with a faint smell of pine and damp earth, and the sky above was a dull gray, like it might rain soon. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the short path to the front door. The place looked older up close, but not in a bad way. The wood had that weathered charm, with a few patches of peeling paint here and there. The porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped up to the door and turned the key the owner had left for me. Inside, the cabin felt just as it had in the photos, but everything was a little more lived in, a little less pristine. The wooden floors were scratched. The air smelled like dust and old furniture, and the furniture itself was a mix of mismatched chairs and old couches. There was a fireplace in the corner, a small kitchen area with a stove and a table, and a set of stairs leading up to a small loft. A few windows let in the dim light, casting soft shadows on the walls. I wasn't sure what exactly I had expected, but I remember feeling a small thrill at how remote it felt. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, nothing. Just the cabin, the woods, and me. I had a few books, my journal, and a guitar to pass the time. I unpacked my things, stashed my food in the small fridge, and started a fire in the hearth. The crackle of the wood was comforting as the darkness outside thickened. That night, as the fire crackled and I ate my simple dinner, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't like I was afraid, but there was a quiet tension in the air. Something about being so far out in the middle of nowhere made me more aware of every sound. The wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional animal noise broke the silence. I figured I'd get used to it, but as the night wore on, a subtle unease began to creep in. It wasn't the usual unease you feel in the dark, like something was lurking in the corners of your vision. No, this was different. It was like I wasn't supposed to be there, like the forest was too still, too silent. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was overthinking everything. I locked up for the night, making sure the windows and doors were secure before heading upstairs to the loft. It was small, just enough room for a bed, a chair, and a small window that looked out into the dark woods. I pulled the covers over myself, trying to relax, but the stillness of the night made sleep difficult. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside. The silence between those sounds felt like it was pressing down on me. Eventually, I drifted off, but it wasn't a deep sleep. The kind of sleep where you're aware of your surroundings but can't fully wake up. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something outside. It was a faint noise, a rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A distinct, crunching noise, like something heavy stepping on dry leaves. It was unmistakable. Something was out there. I sat up in bed, listening. The cabin was so quiet, I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The noise came again, closer still. I felt a cold prickling on the back of my neck, and I suddenly felt very, very alone. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, my hands trembling. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the silence outside was almost worse than the noise. I turned on the flashlight and crept downstairs, holding my breath. The house felt too big, too empty. My footsteps felt deafening on the wooden floors. I made my way to the front door, peeking through the small window beside it. The beam from my flashlight cut through the night, but there was nothing there. No movement, no animals, nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just the isolation, the quiet, the unknown. There was no reason to be scared. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to get back to sleep. But something in my gut told me that something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to shake off the strange feelings from the night before. The sun was shining brightly, the sky was clear, and the birds were singing. I went outside to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The cabin was surrounded by trees, and the ground sloped down toward a small creek that babbled in the distance. I walked down to the creek, the water cool and clear as it rushed over rocks. The sound of it was peaceful, calming. I squatted down to take a drink from the water, but then something caught my eye. There, on the ground, was a patch of disturbed earth. The soil was freshly churned, like something had dug at it recently. It didn't look like animal tracks. It looked more like something had been dragged through the ground. My stomach dropped. I couldn't explain why, but it unsettled me. I glanced around the woods, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. But there was nothing, just the trees and the creek, the same as before. I spent the next few hours hiking through the woods, trying to push the uneasy thoughts from my mind. But as I walked further, I noticed something strange. The trees around me seemed thicker, denser, as if the forest was closing in. I hadn't realized how far I'd gone until I looked up and saw that the cabin was no longer in sight. I started to head back, but that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was following me. Panic started to rise in my chest, and I quickened my pace, but the footsteps seemed to keep up with me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the sound of animals, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. The crunching of the leaves behind me was too consistent, too human. I finally broke into a run, the woods blurring around me. My breath came in quick gasps, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to know what was behind me. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands shaking. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't explain what had happened or who or what had been following me. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone out here. As the day wore on, the feeling didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sense that something was off about this place, that the forest wasn't just silent, but watching. Even as the sun began to set, I couldn't bring myself to go outside again. That night, I sat by the fire, the crackle of the wood the only sound in the cabin. The shadows seemed to move on their own, the light flickering in strange patterns across the walls. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. I didn't care how much I'd paid for the weekend, or how beautiful the cabin looked in the daylight. Something about this place felt wrong, like it had been waiting for someone to step into it. And now that I was here, it didn't want me to leave. I decided I would pack up and leave the next morning, but sleep came slowly. The unease from the previous nights gnawed at me, and I woke up every few hours, the sound of something moving outside the cabin still echoing in my mind. Finally, at first light, I packed up my things. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't leave fast enough. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the cabin grow smaller and smaller in the distance. I was almost out of the woods when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the cabin, was a figure. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. It was hunched over, almost like it was crouching, its form blending with the trees. The flash of pale skin under the shadow of the trees sent a wave of terror through me. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I don't know what it was, and I don't care to. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, a small cabin in the woods, and the sound of nature. That's all I wanted. I've always been the type of person who craves quiet, away from the noise of the city, away from distractions, away from everything. Just solitude. I found the cabin online. The listing was simple: a rustic log cabin, tucked deep in a secluded forest, an hour's drive from the nearest town. The pictures showed a small, cozy space surrounded by trees, with a wide front porch and a view of a small lake, the kind of place where you could just sit and lose yourself in nature for a few days. No neighbors for miles, no one to bother me. The price was good, and the place seemed perfect. I had my bags packed, my books ready, and I couldn't wait to get there. When I arrived, it was exactly what I expected, maybe even better. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall pines. It looked like it had been here for a long time. Its wood darkened by time, but it still had a charm to it. I could feel the stress from the week begin to melt away as I stepped out of my car. The air was crisp and fresh, the scent of pine filling my lungs. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a warm glow on everything. The inside of the cabin was just as inviting. A stone fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen tucked into the corner, and a loft bedroom that overlooked the main living area. There was a rustic charm to it all: wooden beams overhead, mismatched furniture, an old armchair by the fire. I immediately felt at home. I unloaded my things and lit a fire, then sat down with a book on the couch. The wind outside began to pick up, rustling the branches of the trees, but it was a comforting sound, like nature itself was whispering around me. I spent the evening reading, drinking a cup of tea, and enjoying the quiet. When night fell, I went to bed, content. The bed was firm but comfortable, the kind of mattress that made you feel like you were sleeping on a cloud. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and it lulled me to sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt off. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow, and the wind had died down completely. It was eerily still, almost too still. I shook it off, figuring it was just my imagination. Maybe the weather was changing, or maybe it was just the isolation. I went about my morning, making coffee and staring out at the lake. The water was calm, the reflection of the trees mirrored perfectly on the surface. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was a feeling in the pit of my stomach, something that told me I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. It was subtle, something that lurked just beyond my awareness, but it was there. Later in the afternoon, I decided to go for a walk around the property, just to explore. The cabin was built on a decent amount of land, and I could see the trail leading down to a small creek in the distance. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every time I stopped and listened, there was nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my footsteps and my breathing. I kept going, my eyes darting between the trees. The trail was narrow, overgrown with thick brush in some places, and the further I went, the more oppressive the woods seemed. I found myself wishing I had brought a map or at least some kind of guide, but I had no intention of getting lost. I had a phone with me, and I told myself I would just walk to the creek, take a few photos, and head back. But when I got to the creek, I saw something strange. At first, I thought it was just an old log, half submerged in the water, but as I got closer, I saw that it was something else, something that didn't belong in the water. It was a bundle of twigs and branches, tied together with what looked like old rope, and it was floating just above the surface, bobbing gently in the current. I knelt down to get a better look. My curiosity piqued. There was something about it that felt wrong. The way it was arranged, it didn't look natural. As I reached out to touch it, I heard a crack behind me. I spun around, heart racing. Nothing, just the trees still as ever. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it and turned back to the bundle. My fingers brushed against the twigs, and for a moment, I thought I felt something warm. Then, just as quickly, the warmth faded. I pulled my hand back, feeling uneasy. I wanted to get back to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I took a deep breath, stood up, and turned to walk back. But as I did, something caught my eye: movement. Through the trees, just a flash of something white. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see nothing, but the feeling in the air had changed. It was no longer still and quiet. It was tense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I started walking faster, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. When I finally made it back to the clearing, I almost ran to the cabin. The door was still locked, the windows still closed. Everything seemed fine, but that uneasy feeling lingered. I spent the rest of the day indoors, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The hours passed slowly, the wind picking up again as the evening approached. I tried to settle in, but the isolation felt different now, more oppressive. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before: footprints, fresh ones, leading up to the door of the cabin. I stood frozen, staring at the marks in the dirt, my heart racing. The prints were large, deep, and they didn't look like animal tracks. They were human. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to stay. My phone had no service, and I didn't have any way of contacting anyone. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, maybe someone else in the area, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. There was no one around for miles. I checked the windows again, making sure they were locked, then pulled the curtains tight. The whole cabin felt too small, too confined. I tried to sit down, to breathe, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The night passed in a blur of anxiety. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to a soft noise in the middle of the night. It was faint, like a scratching sound, coming from the back of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again. Scratching, dragging, almost like something was moving along the wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, wide awake, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise continued for what felt like hours, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The thought of what I might see, what might be out there, kept me frozen under the covers. By morning, the noise had stopped. I wanted to leave, but the road back to town would be another hour, and I didn't want to face whatever was out there. I decided to pack my things and head out as soon as I could. But as I opened the door to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints from the night before were still there, but they weren't the only ones. There were new tracks, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I took one last look at the cabin, then grabbed my things and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and as I pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The trees were still, the wind had died down again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Just me, the cabin, and the woods, nothing else. I had rented it through a small listing online. The cabin was old, but from the pictures it seemed charming enough. Tucked away in the woods, far from any kind of civilization. It sounded perfect. I had been stressed out with work lately, and this felt like the ideal break. The kind of place where you could get away from the noise, from the constant pressure. I needed some peace. The drive up was uneventful. The roads were quiet, and as I turned off the main highway, the pavement turned into gravel. It wasn't long before the trees closed in on either side of the road, thick with the kind of silence you only find far away from people. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It was just as the photos had shown. Small, rustic, and surrounded by tall trees that stretched up into the sky. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. The place had that stillness about it, the kind that makes everything feel a bit heavy, but it was also peaceful in a way. The door was unlocked when I arrived. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something else, maybe a bit musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. The furniture was simple but comfortable. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small kitchen with old but well-maintained appliances. It felt lived in, though not by anyone recently. I unpacked my things, hung my jacket, and set up the place. The cabin didn't have any Wi-Fi, which was part of the appeal for me. No distractions. I thought I would just relax, maybe read a book, cook a simple dinner, and go to bed early. But as the evening wore on, there was something about the place that kept me on edge. It wasn't the cabin itself, more like the silence that surrounded it. I was used to quiet places, but this felt different. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind you get in the countryside. It was thick, almost oppressive. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard so little. It made my own thoughts seem louder. After a simple meal of pasta and some vegetables, I settled into the small living room, pulling a blanket over my legs. The only sound was the occasional crackle from the fire in the stove. Outside, the darkness pressed in on the windows. It was strange to think that not a single light could be seen for miles. The thought of being so far out in the middle of nowhere felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. I tried to push those thoughts away and read for a while, but soon I noticed something odd. It was hard to explain, but I kept hearing a sound from outside. I thought it might have been the wind or maybe an animal moving through the brush. It wasn't loud, just faint, like a soft rustling, but it was consistent. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. The sound persisted, and now it felt like it was getting closer. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal. I was in the woods, after all, but there was something about it, the way it seemed deliberate, almost purposeful, that kept me from relaxing. I decided to go outside, thinking maybe a quick look around would calm me down. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, but not unpleasant. The woods stretched out before me, dark and silent, but there was something different about the way the trees stood. I don't know how to explain it, but the stillness felt wrong. I walked around the cabin, shining the beam of the flashlight through the trees. The rustling was still there, but it wasn't just one direction. It was coming from all around me now. My skin prickled with unease. I turned back toward the cabin, telling myself I was being foolish. Nothing out here would hurt me. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of my flashlight's beam. My heart stopped, and I froze in place. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and standing completely still. It was just far enough that I couldn't make out any details, but it was there. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, unsure what to do. My mind raced, trying to figure out who it could be. Maybe another hiker or someone else renting a cabin nearby. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. No one had mentioned anything about other guests when I checked in. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching me. I felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. If it were anyone else, they would have called out or waved. But this person didn't acknowledge me at all. They just stood there. I took a step back, then another, slowly moving toward the cabin. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I reached for the door, my breath coming faster now. That's when the figure finally moved. They didn't walk. They just stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I couldn't even tell which direction they went. The silence returned, just as heavy as it had been before. I rushed inside and locked the door, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I sat down on the couch, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was just the stress of the week catching up to me. But I knew deep down that it hadn't been my imagination. That person had been real, and they were out there. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, sitting in that cabin, too scared to do anything but wait. The hours passed slowly, the darkness outside pressing in on me. I kept hearing sounds in the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to look again. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I went about my day, cooking breakfast, walking around the cabin, trying to get rid of the heavy feeling in my chest. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how isolated I really was. There was no one nearby, no one who could help me if something happened. I spent the day locked up in the cabin, not daring to venture far. As the sun began to set again, I felt the anxiety building inside me once more. The silence of the woods felt more oppressive than ever, and I knew that if I stayed another night, I might not be able to handle it. That's when I heard it again. The rustling. It was unmistakable this time. It was too loud, too deliberate. My blood ran cold. I knew it wasn't an animal. It was coming from the other side of the cabin. I ran to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. There, standing in the exact same spot as the night before, was the figure. The same tall, dark figure, watching me, couldn't breathe. I felt trapped, like the walls of the cabin were closing in on me. I grabbed my keys, rushed to the door, and without thinking, I bolted out into the night. I didn't care about anything at that moment, just getting away. My mind was spinning with panic. I ran down the gravel road, barely noticing the dark trees closing in around me. I wasn't thinking, I just knew I had to get away. It wasn't until I had run a good distance, my legs burning and my heart still racing, that I heard the sound of an engine behind me. I turned, half expecting to see the figure following me. But no, it was just a truck, headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver slowed, rolled down the window. "You lost?" the driver called out. I almost collapsed with relief. The man looked like he'd been working on the nearby farm, his face weathered from years of hard labor. He looked concerned. "I need a ride. Please," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the door, and I climbed in without hesitation. As we drove back to town, I finally let myself breathe again, my heart slowly returning to normal. Once we were in town, I paid the man and thanked him profusely. I didn't stop to check the time, but I knew I wouldn't be going back to that cabin. It wasn't the isolation. It wasn't the woods. It was the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something wasn't right. And I never found out who or what that person was. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. That place was meant to be a getaway, but instead, it had become a nightmare, and I was glad to leave it behind. I had never been the type to take risks, but when my friend Lucas suggested a weekend getaway in a remote cabin, I didn't think much of it. It sounded peaceful, an opportunity to escape the noise of city life, to breathe in some fresh air, and maybe do some reading or stargazing. What could go wrong? The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from the city, tucked away in a forested area. We'd rented it through an online listing, a small but cozy-looking place. As we drove deeper into the woods, the road grew narrower, and the trees on both sides became more imposing, their thick trunks crowding us like silent sentinels. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation that unsettled me or the deepening sense of unfamiliarity. There were no other cars on the road, and the occasional house we passed was so far off the beaten path that I wondered how anyone lived out here. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the clearing in front of the house. The building itself was old, weathered wood, dark shingles, and a faint smell of pine sap in the air. It looked charming enough, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl as I stepped out of the car. Maybe it was the silence, the absence of any noise except the rustling of leaves. There wasn't even a breeze. "I'll go check out the inside," Lucas said, grabbing the key from the back seat. His casual tone did nothing to settle my nerves. I followed him into the cabin, and as soon as the door creaked open, a musty smell hit me, the air thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, though everything was in its place. An old leather couch sat by a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area to the left was stocked with basic supplies. The hardwood floors creaked with every step, and I felt like the building was alive, shifting beneath us. Lucas tossed his backpack onto the couch and went to explore upstairs. I didn't follow. Something about being alone in this house made me uneasy. I sat down on the couch, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. It was strange. There was no reason for me to feel so tense. The cabin was just old, that's all. Night fell quickly, and the forest outside seemed to close in on us. The only light came from the flickering lamp by the couch and the faint glow of the stars through the window. Lucas was in the kitchen, rummaging around for something to make for dinner, and I found myself staring at the fireplace, watching the flames dance and crackle. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so quiet I thought I imagined it. A faint rustling, like something brushing against the cabin. But then it happened again, louder this time, a steady scraping sound. I tried to dismiss it, but it wouldn't stop. The longer I listened, the more certain I was that it was coming from outside. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I stood up, moving toward the window. Outside, the trees seemed even darker than before, the shadows impossibly deep. The wind had picked up, howling through the branches, making the rustling noises even harder to place. I couldn't see anything beyond the clearing, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "What's that sound?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Lucas didn't answer at first, and I heard him walking toward me. "Just the wind, probably," he said, peering out the window with me. I wanted to believe him, but something about his voice was a little too casual. His gaze lingered for a moment too long on the trees, and when he turned back, his face was a little too pale. "Are you sure?" I pressed. He didn't say anything at first, just shrugged. "Yeah, probably nothing. Let's just get dinner going." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. After dinner, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but the noises persisted. Every time the wind picked up, the scraping and dragging would return. It was as if the forest itself was alive, scratching at the walls, waiting for something. Around midnight, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, hoping that whatever it was would just be some animal, some branch caught in the wind. But the moment my boots hit the cold dirt of the clearing, the sound stopped. For a long, tense moment, I stood there, listening, hoping for something to give me a clue. Nothing. I walked around the cabin, shining the beam of the flashlight through the trees. The beams flickered off the bark, catching glimpses of movement in the underbrush. It felt like something was watching me from the darkness, but when I swung the light around, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Then, from behind me, I heard a loud crack, a snap of a branch breaking, loud enough to send a shock through my body. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive than before. I went back inside, locking the door behind me and feeling the tension in my chest build. "I don't like this," I muttered, my voice low. Lucas raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He seemed lost in thought, staring at the fire again. "You sure it's nothing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yeah," he replied without looking at me. "Probably just some animal. Maybe a bear or something." I didn't buy it. There was something off about this place, something that felt wrong in a way that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the noises, it was the feeling that came with them, like they were purposeful, deliberate. like whatever was out there knew we were here. The night dragged on. I lay in bed, wide awake, the darkness pressing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside felt amplified, like it was part of something bigger. I could hear Lucas snoring softly, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, or a faint rustling of leaves, but whenever I listened closer, it would stop. I stayed like that for hours, listening to the silence, feeling the walls close in. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. But even in sleep, I dreamed of dragging sounds and shadows moving outside the window. Morning came too soon, and I woke to the sound of birds chirping, the sun filtering through the trees. But the relief was short-lived. When I looked out the window, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Tracks. Deep gouges in the dirt, leading from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin. They were fresh, still damp with dew, and they weren't from any animal I recognized. The marks were too long, too deliberate, like someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. My pulse quickened, and I turned to Lucas, who was still in the kitchen, humming to himself. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but the sight of those tracks felt like the last piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me, confused. "Leave? It's just a few tracks. Probably from a deer or something." I shook my head. "No, this feels wrong." Lucas didn't seem convinced, but he agreed to pack up. We spent the next hour gathering our things, but every step we took felt like we were being watched. The tracks were all over the clearing, converging toward the cabin, and that eerie feeling never left. We were nearly finished packing when I heard a noise. A thud, followed by the sound of something scraping along the wooden floor. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Lucas froze too, his face drained of color. The door was still shut, the windows locked, but it was as if someone was still inside. Without thinking, I bolted out the front door, grabbing my bag, and ran toward the car. My hands were shaking, but I fumbled with the keys and got the engine running. Lucas followed, his face pale, and we sped away without looking back. As we drove, the cabin seemed to fade into the trees behind us, but the sense of being followed never left. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us in those woods. The dragging sounds, the tracks, they weren't just some random event. They were a warning. We made it out, safe, but I'm never going back to that cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that dragging sound again, faint but persistent, like it's calling me back to the woods. I never expected a weekend getaway to turn into something I'd never be able to forget. I'm not one for horror stories or anything supernatural, but something happened that weekend that rattled me to my core. And it all started with a cabin, one that I'd found online, tucked away in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat.
No distractions.
No city noise, just me, my thoughts, and nature. The perfect escape from the grind. The cabin was small, rustic, the kind of place that promised a full immersion in nature. It wasn't far from town, just a couple of hours, tucked off the beaten path, hidden among tall trees and winding dirt roads. The journey up wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. The GPS led me down a bumpy dirt road that grew narrower and rougher the further I went. The trees around me seemed to close in, their towering trunks like silent sentinels, blocking out much of the sun. It was peaceful at first. I loved how the forest seemed to swallow all the noise of the world. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder if I'd gone too far off course. I kept driving, past isolated patches of trees, until I saw the cabin. It was a small, weather-beaten building made of dark wood, sitting alone among a small clearing. At first glance, it looked quaint, exactly like the pictures on the website. A porch with a couple of old rocking chairs, a small chimney puffing out a faint trail of smoke, and a backdrop of dense woods. I parked the car and stepped out into the quiet. The air was fresh but cool, and the silence was almost suffocating. There were no birds chirping, no animals scurrying about. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the leaves. It struck me as odd but not unsettling. I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way to the front door. The key was hidden under a small rock beside the door, just like the instructions had said. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was as rustic as the outside, with a heavy, earthy smell that filled my nostrils. Old wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the furniture was mismatched but comfortable. A couch, a couple of armchairs, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area were all in place. A large window in the living room overlooked the woods, and I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of unease as I gazed at the dense forest outside. I dropped my bag and settled in, unpacking my things and making myself a cup of coffee. There was a note on the kitchen counter from the property owner, welcoming me and giving a few instructions about the cabin. The message was short and friendly, but it didn't mention much about the surrounding area. No directions to nearby towns, no suggestions for things to do. Just a simple enjoy your stay and a list of emergency contact numbers. I didn't think much of it and decided to take a walk around the property. The woods surrounding the cabin seemed almost impenetrable. The trees were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that made me feel like they were watching me. It was strange how the forest felt so alive, but not in a welcoming way. The air had a damp chill, and the silence hung heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, though I saw nothing but trees and leaves. I returned to the cabin, deciding to settle in for the night. It was just me, alone in this isolated spot. There was no TV, no phone signal, no internet, just the fire crackling in the fireplace and the quiet outside. It should have been peaceful. It should have been exactly what I wanted. But as the night drew on, I started to hear things. It started with a faint tapping sound. Soft at first, like someone was knocking on the door. But when I checked, the porch was empty. The woods outside were still. There was nothing but the wind, but even that seemed unnaturally quiet. I shrugged it off as a branch brushing against the cabin, something harmless. The tapping continued throughout the evening, becoming more distinct as the hours passed. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, the roof, or perhaps somewhere underneath the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a faint scrape, followed by that same gentle knock. It was driving me mad. Around midnight, I heard a louder sound. It came from outside this time, something heavy scraping against the wood. I jumped up from my seat, my heart racing. I didn't want to go out there. I didn't want to look, but I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. I shone the flashlight into the woods, scanning the darkness. The beam caught only trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. There was nothing except the sound, the unmistakable scraping sound, like something large was dragging along the ground. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, from the tree line. I felt my pulse quicken. The woods seemed to close in, and for the first time I felt real fear. I decided to get inside. Fast. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, hoping that whatever it was would stay outside. The sound continued for a few more minutes before it finally stopped. But then, something else happened. I could feel it, a presence, like someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching me through the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. But then I heard something even worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They circled around the cabin, scraping across the wooden floor, getting closer to the door. I held my breath, my body frozen with fear. The steps stopped right outside the window next to the door. I could see nothing, but I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of the footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was outside wasn't something I could fight. The steps moved around the cabin again, then stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. And then nothing. The footsteps disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the walls, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed off in the armchair, my eyes darting open every few minutes, checking the windows, the door. But nothing came back. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun had risen, and the world seemed normal again.
No footsteps, no strange sounds.
It was as if the night's events had been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I felt it. I'd heard it. I didn't want to leave the cabin. I didn't want to drive away from whatever that thing was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me to leave so it could follow me. After packing my things in a rush, I drove back down the same winding road, the trees watching me as I left. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was just overtired, or if there was something out there in those woods. All I know is that I won't be going back to that cabin. Not now. Not ever. The woods may have been quiet when I left, but I could feel it. Something was still there, waiting for the next person to come. I've always liked the idea of getting away from everything, of being alone with my thoughts. So when I found a cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles from any town, it felt like the perfect escape. No one around, just nature, peace, and quiet. I didn't even hesitate when I saw the ad online. The listing made it sound ideal. A secluded, rustic cabin for rent for a week, perfect for solitude. It was more affordable than I expected, too, which only made it more tempting. I packed my things, clothes, some books, a few snacks, and hit the road. I didn't bother telling anyone where I was going. It wasn't like I was planning anything special, just a week to clear my head. The drive itself was peaceful, the kind of drive where the world outside the window looks like a postcard. As I got further from civilization, I felt a kind of excitement building up inside me. It wasn't until I turned off the main road that things started to feel different. The gravel path leading to the cabin was rough, more of a trail than a proper road. The trees crowded in on either side, their branches intertwining like they were trying to block out the sunlight. The air felt heavier here, like it had been untouched for years, maybe even centuries. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. The wooden structure sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The cabin was simple. A small porch with a rocking chair, a slanted roof, and windows with faded curtains. The front door was unlocked, just like they said in the listing. I walked inside and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The inside was cozy, yet there was something off about it. The walls were paneled with dark wood, and a stone fireplace stood at the far end of the room. There were old wooden beams across the ceiling, and the furniture looked aged but sturdy. A small kitchen area was tucked to one side, complete with a gas stove and a rusty fridge. I unpacked my bags, set up my things on the small table by the window, and made myself a cup of coffee. The silence outside was deafening. No birds, no wind, just nothing. It felt unnerving, but I brushed it off. I had the whole week ahead of me. That night, I sat by the fireplace, reading a book by the soft glow of a single lamp. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room, and the longer I sat there, the more the silence outside seemed to creep in. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. It wasn't even a natural darkness. It felt thick, almost suffocating, as though something was hiding out there. I tried not to let my mind wander, but there were noises, subtle at first, like twigs snapping underfoot or a faint rustle in the trees. Could have been animals, I told myself, but the air was so still, so unnaturally quiet, that I found it hard to believe. The first night passed uneventfully, and I managed to fall asleep in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. The bed was soft, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. I was alone, far away from the chaos of everyday life. I told myself I was being silly, but deep down, something gnawed at me. The next day, I decided to explore. I grabbed my camera and headed out the front door, walking along the trail that led deeper into the woods. The trees were thick here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, the kind you'd expect to see in a forest that had been standing for centuries. The air was dense with the smell of pine and damp earth. I followed the trail for a good while, taking photos of the strange beauty of the place. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the way the world felt so far away. But then, I noticed something strange. The trail started to fork, leading off into different directions, and each path felt more unnatural than the last. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches reaching out like arms trying to pull me in. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. That's when I saw it. Something in the distance, a figure barely visible between the trees, standing completely still. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart began to race. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, maybe a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. The woods felt oppressive now, like they were closing in on me, the air thick with a kind of waiting. That night, things got worse. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard something outside. It was a sound I hadn't heard before, soft, almost like a whisper. I stood up and walked to the window, my hand gripping the edge of the curtain. Nothing, just the darkness. But the feeling, it was different now. The unease had grown into something deeper, something more primal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan the cabin made. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or an animal, but the longer I listened, the more it felt like something was trying to get in. The next day, I decided to leave. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I packed up my things quickly, ready to head back to civilization. But as I walked toward the door, I stopped. The air outside had changed. The stillness was gone, replaced by an eerie tension, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stepped out onto the porch, and then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. It was a man, tall, with ragged clothes, his face hidden in shadow. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could react, the figure disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I grabbed my bag, jumped in the car, and drove away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached the highway. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I finally calmed down enough to think clearly. What had I seen? Who was that man, and why had he been there? I couldn't explain it, but one thing was certain. I'd never go back to that cabin again. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I finally felt a sense of peace. It had been a rough few months. My mind was overstuffed with the noise of work, city life, and an overwhelming list of problems that I couldn't seem to escape. So I decided to get away. I found this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, just outside a tiny town tucked in the Appalachian foothills. The kind of place where cell phones didn't work, and the only sound you could hear was the wind rustling through the trees. The ideal spot to clear my head. I remember pulling up to the cabin on that rainy afternoon, the kind of drizzle that never seemed to end. The sort of rain that was just heavy enough to make everything feel damp, but not quite heavy enough to make you think about grabbing an umbrella. The road to the cabin was dirt, uneven, and barely wide enough for my car. I almost wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn at some point, but the GPS said it was the right path. The cabin itself was small but cozy, a wooden structure with a steep, slanted roof. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides, their tall trunks reaching high into the misty sky. The windows were fogged up with condensation, and the front porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The place looked old, weathered, but it had character. It was exactly what I needed. I went inside, unlocked the door, and the first thing that hit me was the musty smell. The kind of smell that comes from years of sitting idle with no one to care for it. I didn't mind, though. It gave the place a certain charm. The interior was simple, furnishings straight out of the 80s, with a wood-burning stove in the corner, a few worn couches, and a kitchen with everything you'd need but nothing fancy. Cabin through and through. After settling in, I took a moment to look around. I'd brought books, food, and my laptop, but I had no intention of using it unless I absolutely had to. I was here to escape, not to work. I sat by the window, watching the rain fall outside, and tried to let the quiet settle in. But the silence was strange. First, it was comforting, peaceful even, but as time went on, I began to notice things. Little things. The way the wind seemed to rustle the branches in a way that didn't match the strength of the breeze outside. The way the floorboards creaked, even when I was standing still. And then, as dusk began to fall, I heard something else. A sound. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. Just a low groan, like the house settling. But it kept happening, a regular pattern of groaning. Then silence. Then another groan. It wasn't the wind. I knew that much. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow. I figured it was the old wood shifting, maybe even the pipes or the foundation. Still, it was unsettling. I made dinner and tried to focus on the small comfort of the fire crackling in the stove. The light from the flames flickered in the dark room, casting long shadows against the walls. Everything seemed fine, except for that damn noise. I tried to shake it off and finished my meal, deciding that I'd go to bed early and try to sleep through whatever this was. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The rain had stopped, but now there was an eerie stillness outside. A silence so complete, it felt like the world had gone to sleep with me. That's when I heard it again, the groan. But this time it was closer, much closer. I lay still, barely breathing, trying to understand what was happening. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a strange scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. My heart started to race, and I could feel the blood pumping in my ears. I wanted to get up and check, but fear held me in place. It was as if my body was paralyzed, unable to move. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scraping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, my ears strained for any sound, any hint of what was going on. But it was just silence again. I didn't know what to make of it, but I finally forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy feeling in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than the house settling, just the natural creaks of an old building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got dressed and stepped outside to clear my head. The morning fog was thick, and everything felt damp, even the air. I decided to take a walk into the woods, hoping to find some peace. But as I wandered deeper into the trees, I noticed something strange. Tracks, fresh ones. They weren't animal tracks, though. They were too large and seemed off. I couldn't place them, but they weren't human either. Something about them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, but my instincts told me to head back to the cabin. There was a sudden tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite control. The rest of the day passed without incident, though the unease didn't go away. I decided to check the cabin for anything that could explain the noises. Maybe a rodent or some other animal had gotten into the walls. I inspected every corner, checked the attic, and even looked under the cabin, but I couldn't find anything. As night fell again, I sat by the fire, trying to distract myself with a book, but the quiet was unbearable. My thoughts kept returning to the strange tracks, the unsettling groans, the dragging sound I'd heard. I was starting to feel paranoid, like the cabin was closing in on me. That night, I kept the light on, despite knowing that it probably wouldn't make any difference. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I heard the groans again, closer this time. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever it was in the cabin with me. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept out of bed. My heart was pounding as I moved through the cabin, the beam of light shaking in my hand. The noises were constant now, coming from the walls, from underneath the floorboards. It was like something was crawling around, trying to get out. I checked every corner, every closet, but I couldn't find anything. Then, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The distinct sound of footsteps on the floor above me. I ran to the attic stairs and threw open the door. The space was small, just a crawl space with low beams. I climbed up into the attic, my flashlight flickering. The floor was covered with dust, untouched for years. But there was something else, something that made my stomach churn. A pile of old clothes scattered across the floor, but not just clothes. I could see what looked like dirt and dried blood. I backed away slowly, my body shaking. Suddenly, I heard the noise again, louder now, closer. I turned around, and standing at the far end of the attic was something I will never forget. It wasn't human, not anymore. It was twisted, disfigured, its body bent in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It stared at me with hollow eyes, its mouth hanging open, dripping with something dark. I screamed, stumbling backward, and the thing lunged at me. I barely made it down the stairs before it grabbed my ankle, pulling me toward it. But with every ounce of strength, I kicked and fought, finally breaking free and running out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached the town. The cabin was still standing when I looked back, but I knew it wasn't just an old building. It was something else. The police never found anything. No evidence of the thing I saw. No tracks. Just an abandoned cabin. But I know what I saw, and I know that I will never go back there again. That night was the last I spent in that place. I never did figure out what it was or why it was there, but one thing was certain. Some things aren't meant to be found. It had been a long week at work, and the idea of escaping to the woods for the weekend seemed like the perfect remedy. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. No distractions, no cell service, just the peace of nature. A few friends had offered to join, but I preferred solitude. It felt better to be alone, away from everything and everyone, to recharge and find clarity. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense trees. The air had that crispness to it, the kind that made you take a deep breath and feel alive. I drove to the spot where I had planned to set up camp, far enough from the main trail but not so isolated that I'd feel uneasy. Just the right balance. I had a tent, a hammock, and the basic supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty knife. Everything I needed to get by. The campsite was nestled between a small creek and a towering ridge. The sound of rushing water from the creek was soothing, and I figured it would be the perfect background noise for the night. I started setting up my tent, unpacking my gear with methodical precision. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in soft beams, giving everything an ethereal glow. By the time I had everything in place, the sun had nearly set. I built a fire, watching the flames crackle and dance. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air. I ate my dinner, simple but satisfying, and settled into my hammock afterward, enjoying the serenity. But something was off. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness of the woods. There was a slight tension in the air. The sounds of birds and insects had died down, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was out here alone. I grabbed a book from my bag to distract myself, but the unease lingered. A few hours later, as the moon climbed high in the sky, I decided it was time to turn in. The night was too quiet. I zipped myself into my tent, the fabric thin and reassuring, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling in the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling continued, growing louder, as if something was moving around my camp. My heart began to beat faster. I knew there were animals in the area, deer, squirrels, maybe a bear, but this didn't sound like the usual wildlife. This was deliberate, methodical, the sound of something or someone moving closer. I stayed completely still, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The rustling stopped, but I didn't relax. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tent's entrance. Nothing. I couldn't see anything, but the silence was suffocating. Maybe it was just an animal, but the rational part of my brain couldn't ignore the oddness of it. It felt too purposeful, too coordinated. I waited for what seemed like hours, but eventually, the noises stopped. I let out a shaky breath, convinced I was just being paranoid. I turned off the flashlight and tried to sleep, telling myself that everything was fine. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I felt drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I checked my camp, but everything seemed normal. My tent was untouched, my fire pit cold, my food bag where I left it. No signs of animals or anything out of the ordinary. I decided to hike for a while, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. The trail took me deeper into the forest, away from the camp. The woods were beautiful, full of towering trees and colorful autumn leaves. But even as I marveled at the scenery, that feeling of being watched never quite left me. After a few hours, I made my way back to the campsite. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The area around my camp was disturbed. The ground had been dug up in several places, the dirt overturned in a way that didn't look natural. My heart began to race. I knelt down and examined the marks. They weren't animal tracks, too large and too deliberate. Something had been digging around my campsite, and it wasn't a bear or a raccoon. I searched the area, feeling more exposed than ever. The woods, which had seemed so inviting at first, now felt ominous. My nerves were frayed, and the weight of the previous night's events hung over me like a dark cloud. I checked my supplies. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day pacing around, trying to stay busy, trying to stay alert. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I knew night was coming again. The fear from last night gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I didn't want to be the person who left just because of a few odd noises. I made another fire and sat by it, my mind racing. That's when I heard it again. The same rustling sound from the night before, this time closer, more pronounced. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the flashlight in my hand. I scanned the dark perimeter of my camp, but saw nothing. Then, there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd heard before, came from the trees just outside my camp. I froze, not daring to move. My mind raced through possible explanations. An animal? Person? But none of them felt right. The growl was too deep, too unnatural. I grabbed my knife and moved to the edge of the firelight. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a series of loud, quick footsteps. Something moving fast. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of it. My hands trembled, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and panicked. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my pack, shoved my gear into it as quickly as I could, and unzipped the tent. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. I ran through the woods, the ground uneven beneath my feet, the trees blurring past. The growls continued, always just behind me, like a predator stalking its prey. My mind screamed for me to stop, to take a breath, but I couldn't. I pushed on, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know how long I ran. The dark forest seemed endless, the growls never fading, always in pursuit. My legs burned, my chest ached for air, but I kept running. Then, as suddenly as it began, the growling stopped. The air was thick with silence, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my heart. I slowed to a stop, my body trembling with exhaustion. I could barely see in the dark, but I knew I had to keep moving. I needed to find shelter, safety. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a ranger's cabin. One of those old, abandoned structures meant for emergencies. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I collapsed to the floor, too tired to stand. The growls were gone, but the fear hadn't left me. I spent the rest of the night in the cabin, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to even move. When morning came, I didn't wait. I left the cabin and walked back to the main road, hitching a ride to the nearest town. The woods, the camp, everything felt like a distant nightmare. I never went back to that place. Looking back, I can't explain what happened. I've tried to make sense of it in the years since, but nothing fits. There was no clear danger, no visible threat, but the terror I felt was real. Some things in nature, I believe, aren't meant to be understood. I had always loved camping. It was my escape, my chance to disconnect from the noise of everyday life and just enjoy nature. But this trip was different. There was something unsettling about it from the moment I pulled into the campsite. The sun was setting, casting a warm, orange glow over the trees, but the air felt still, too still. It wasn't the peaceful calm you expect in nature. It was like the air itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I was used to camping alone, so I was probably just overthinking things. I set up camp in the usual spot, near the edge of a forest, close enough to the river to hear the soothing sound of water trickling over rocks. The tent went up easily, and I started a small fire, just enough to keep the chill at bay as the night descended. As I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet it was. Normally, by this time, there would be the sounds of insects, birds settling in for the night, or the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. But tonight, there was nothing. No animals, no wind, no rustling leaves, just an overwhelming silence. I shrugged it off again, telling myself that maybe it was just a quiet night. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and took a long drink from my thermos, feeling the warmth spread through me. I didn't realize how much time had passed, but when I looked up, the last traces of daylight were gone, and the darkness had settled in. The fire flickered in front of me, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the campsite. I grabbed a book from my bag, trying to distract myself from the eerie stillness that hung in the air. But my eyes kept darting to the trees, to the edge of the forest where the shadows seemed to grow deeper with every passing minute. The longer I sat there, the more it felt like I was being watched. I brushed the thought away, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. It wasn't like I felt threatened exactly, just uneasy, like there was something out there, just beyond the trees that didn't belong. I tried to focus on the fire, watching the flames lick the wood, but my mind kept wandering. It wasn't until I heard the first sound that I truly started to feel alarmed. A branch cracked somewhere in the woods. It was faint, but it was enough to make me freeze. I strained my ears, listening carefully. There was no wind, no breeze, just the soft rustling of the fire. The noise came again, closer this time. Another crack of a branch, followed by a soft thud, like something heavy stepping on dry leaves. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I was used to hearing animals at night, deer, raccoons, maybe the occasional fox, but this didn't sound like any of those. The noises were getting closer, the sounds of footsteps, deliberate and slow. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of the fire, flicking it on and shining it toward the woods. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing. No movement, no animals, just the trees standing still. I thought about calling it a night, heading to bed and locking myself inside the tent. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The fire crackled and popped in the silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I wanted to get a better look, to see if I could find whatever it was that had been making those sounds. I grabbed my small hatchet from my backpack, just in case. The woods were dark, and even with the flashlight, it felt like I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. But I forced myself to take a few steps into the trees, keeping the fire behind me. The air was colder here, and the silence was even more oppressive. The ground was soft underfoot, and the occasional twig snapped, echoing in the stillness. But still, I couldn't see anything. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the forest, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. I shone the light in every direction, searching for anything that might explain the sounds. The beam bounced off the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. Then I saw it, a shape, a figure, a man standing in the distance, halfway hidden by the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, facing me. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn around and get back to the safety of the campfire, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The figure didn't appear to be armed, but the more I stared at it, the more unnerving it became. I could see the faint outline of a person, but there was no clear detail. No face, no distinguishing features, just a dark shape, standing motionless in the night. I held my breath and took a step back, then another, slowly, carefully. I didn't want to make a sound, but just as I was about to turn around and leave, the figure stepped forward. The movement was so sudden, so deliberate, that it made my heart skip a beat. I didn't know if I was dealing with someone who had wandered into the woods or something far worse, but I didn't care. My instincts screamed at me to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the campsite, the cold night air biting at my skin as I pushed myself harder. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I reached the clearing. The fire still burned, the flames dancing in the breeze. I glanced behind me, but there was no sign of the figure. No one was there. The woods were just as quiet as they had been before. I didn't stop to question it. I ran straight to the tent, threw my gear inside, and zipped it up tightly. I locked the flap, buried myself in my sleeping bag, and waited. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Every little sound made my heart race, every creak of the trees or crackle of the fire setting me on edge. But nothing happened. By morning, I was exhausted, but the strange feeling was gone. The camp was calm, the birds were chirping, and the world seemed normal again. I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. I didn't know what had happened the night before. I didn't know if it had been a person, or if it had just been my imagination playing tricks on me. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. When I reached my car and drove away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The unease that had gripped me the night before seemed to fade with every mile I put between myself and that campsite. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling. The woods felt too quiet that night, too still, and I can't help but wonder if there was something or someone out there in the darkness waiting